Many of you will have heard the word translanguaging in relation to languages teaching. There's a great deal of hype around translanguaging. We want to make sure that you get a sensible, practical understanding of what translanguaging can do and how it might be used in a languages classroom. The one thing is that we know that the conventional view of languages is that two languages are generally taught as two isolated systems. The focus has tended to be historically on the structure of those languages. So you've got the vocabulary, you've got the actual grammatical structure, and so on. But most people who live in bilingual and multilingual parts of the world engage in practices where they bring words, they borrow words from one language, they pop them into the language that they're using. English, by the way, is not a pure language. It is a dog's breakfast of languages, okay? It is just the biggest advertising I think you have another word in Australia. In South Africa, we would say foofy. It is the biggest foofy of all time because it's not actually one language. It's just a collation of languages, okay? We've borrowed from Greek, Roman, every single language community that the English speakers have ever come into contact with. They just pinch their vocabulary, pop them in, and there's English, okay? So what happens is English has been translanguaging. It has been borrowing words. It has been absorbing words. People have been using, alternating between expressions in English or French or German, Latin sometimes. They pop them in all over the place. In South Australia, we borrowed a lot of vocabulary from all of the migrant communities who have come here, and we have borrowed a lot of vocabulary from the indigenous communities who were here before all of us. So code mixing is mixing of languages. Usually you have a dominant structure and you just incorporate a few words or phrases into a dominant language. Code switching can be a chunk of language. You speak or you write or you use a chunk of one language and you switch over and you use another chunk of a language. The technical thing is that if you use at least a clause in a sentence in one language, and you switch over and you then you develop a second clause, a subordinate clause in the second language, you are code switching. If you have one sentence in one language and you alternate with one sentence in a second language, that is code switching. If you speak for 10 minutes in one language or you write a paragraph in one language and you switch over and you write or speak in the other language, that is code switching. We normally do this for particular purposes. It's not arbitrary. Everybody's got a reason for why they do this. We often do this when we want to emphasize something. We often do this for effect. I used to do this with my children if I wanted them to listen to me. They wouldn't listen to me and behave and obey me in English. So I'd have to invoke also because they'd say, ooh. Okay, we use code switching very often for deliberate purposes. Now, sometimes in teaching languages, the idea that children or students might code mix or code switch has got a bad name and it's been regarded as an illegitimate practice. So during the period when we felt that it was necessary to separate two languages completely and use the direct method or the audiolingual method, we said to students in the classroom, you are only going to speak French. You are only going to speak Chinese. But that has never happened in practice. We have always engaged in various code mixing and code switching practices because as teachers we know the students can't understand only the target language. We have to mediate. So we use code switching actually quite purposefully quite often. So what has happened is that there's now a contemporary view that this is a normal thing to do. And because we move back and forth between languages, people have started saying language is not a thing, it's not a noun, it's actually a verb, it's a process. We're involved in languaging. The word translanguaging is a translation of a Welsh term for the practice of purposeful or deliberate code switching in a classroom, in a bilingual classroom between Welsh and English, Welsh used for explaining what's going on, English used for reading and writing perhaps, and vice versa. So that the term originally came from purposeful code switching, usually in order to make students feel comfortable in the classroom. So when we are saying it's important to work with the children or the students' home languages, their English and their additional languages, we try to make things very comfortable for the students in the classroom. We might use translanguaging so that we are promoting students' well-being, we're trying to equalise things, we're trying to make language learning not a big, terrifying ordeal, but it's something where if you don't know everything, you will be able to use your translanguaging practices. So we can use translanguaging for convivial, horizontal purposes, and that helps students to feel comfortable in the classroom. However, it's also our job to ensure that students learn the target language as well as possible. So we also have to find ways to separate the language, and usually the target language we're teaching the vocabulary, we're teaching the sentence structure, we're teaching students to read and write text in the target language. So we use both horizontal and vertical aspects of translanguaging, and what we're trying to suggest here is that it's really important to know that you can use the horizontal approaches to translanguaging for part of the time, but not all of the time. Most likely because you are time strapped, you have to limit that amount of time, and most likely you have to spend most of your time on teaching the target language and separating the languages. But you can use both aspects of translanguaging, and the way to focus on the vertical approach is to use translation, translating things like wise sayings, translating little stories, and reading and writing tasks that the students can work with.
So we've talked a bit about translanguaging, this great buzzword. Thinking about this, I broke down some purposes that translanguaging can serve in your languages classroom. And of course, translanguaging can be English and the target language. It can be home languages and English, home languages and target language, and everything together. So these multilingual practices can support students to work together. It can be a teaching strategy, and it can be something that teachers model to show this is what multilingual people do. It can support fluency in writing, and earlier Kathleen was talking about fluency as, being able to write quickly or just continue without being stuck. And translanguaging can be a very useful little shortcut to say, oh, don't know that word, I'll pop it down and come back to it later. Translanguaging, particularly for students who are multilingual, is a support for their higher order thinking, because they have additional resources which help them think about things from a different perspective, or think with a different level of ease about concepts that you're teaching in the class. Translanguaging, and this is, I find really exciting, can be content that students can analyse to say, hey, what's happening with language here? What's happening with languages together here? And you'll see an example of this. And of course, translation is a really specific set of skills that students can learn and develop from early ages, and with different proficiencies in languages. So these are examples that we will see. Translanguaging for multilingual students is a very purposeful practice. It's always purposeful. It's never an accident, and I'm sure in your own experience you would understand where I'm coming from when I say that. And translanguaging supports relationships, it supports learning, it supports connection to culture and keeping culture and language alive, particularly in an environment that can sometimes feel hostile or a bit limiting when minority languages come into play. And also, really importantly, translanguaging supports personal identity. So I can give you some examples here of what students in this school were doing with language. So we can see here, students use language to support their family and to connect with the community and to make connections between family members and the community through translation. Students use their languages for collaborative learning and to support each other. And you can see in the second example of Selena, she was helping a new student from India in science. But they didn't actually have a shared language as such. So Selena was Afghan, she spoke Hazaragi, she'd lived in Pakistan, and she knew Urdu. The other student was Gujarati, so she spoke Gujarati, but she also knew Hindi. Now, as luck would have it, Hindi and Urdu for these students was mutually comprehensible languages, so they could communicate with each other. But students also use their languages for their independent learning, and you can see the example of Shania, who would, think about something in English, think, no, that's not working, I'll switch to my other language and see what happens, see if I can come up with some more ideas. So translanguaging, none of this happened by accident. All of it took effort, but all of it supported learning, and it was totally worth it. But the question is, what do teachers think? First of all, do they know what's going on? Sometimes. Do they know what to do with it? Not very often. And this is sometimes where we get a bit maybe worried. What do we do with this? But as languages teachers, I think, we have a good foundation and we have an advantage that, yeah, I get this. In a social context, I can see this is not a taboo kind of activity. And the question then becomes, not should it happen or not, but how can I make this into a resource in my classroom? So we can see here that these teachers from different learning areas, we've got HASS, drama, languages and English represented here, that they can see the value of these languages and translanguaging, and that these practices support their students' identities, support their subject learning, support their thinking, and support them in language learning as well. So it can be a tool for fluency, or it can be a type of content for analysis, but we can see here that it's also a learning process as well, and something that's purposeful and worth attending to, I suppose, and thinking about how can we make more of this in our classrooms.